She was 58 years old, and after 34 years of unlocking a building before anyone else arrived, she had $340 in a checking account she was too frightened to look at, and a 2001 Dodge Caravan packed to the roof, with cardboard boxes of library books that nobody had claimed and that she could not bring herself to leave behind when the house was sold out from under her. Ray Pruett had been dead for 14 months when Thank found the second mortgage. And then the third. And then the letters from 3 separate creditors in 3 separate states, all of them addressed to a man Frances had believed. Without ever examining the belief closely enough, she had known completely. The house had been in Ray's name. The savings account had been in Ray's name. The only things Frances had held on to from 34 years of marriage were a library card she had laminated herself, and a cardboard box of her mother's letters, tied with kitchen string, that she kept on the passenger seat because it was the one thing in the van that felt like it still had weight. Frances Pruett had grown up behind a postal counter. Her mother, Viola, had worked the window at the Dunmore Township Post Office in southeastern Kansas for 31 years. Sorting, stamping, calling names across the lobby in a voice that carried like a bell. Frances had done her homework on a stool in the back room as a girl, surrounded by the smell of rubber stamps and paper dust, and the sound of her mother saying "Have a good day now" to everyone who came through, whether she felt it or not, because that was the job. You showed up. You handed people what they had been waiting for. You said "Have a good day now." Viola had told her once, while tying up a bundle of first-class letters, with the same care she brought to everything, that the mail was the closest thing to a promise the government had ever made to ordinary people. She said, "It doesn't matter if you live on a dirt road 20 miles from the nearest town. Someone addressed that envelope to you, and it is our job to make sure it arrives. The mail does not decide who is worth reaching." Frances had carried that idea with her all the way into the Dunmore County Library, where she had been a librarian for 34 years. The library was not so different from the post office. People came in looking for something they could not quite name. Your job was to help them find it, and then to say "Have a good day now," and to mean it, or at least to make the saying of it feel like you meant it. She had stayed long past the hours they paid her for. She had driven her own car on Tuesday afternoons to bring books to homebound seniors on the county's north end. She had known by name every child who passed through the summer reading program for 2 decades running. None of that had been in Ray's name, so none of it counted when the lawyers started adding things up. By the second week of March, she was sleeping in the caravan in the parking lot of a Denny's off I-35, eating from a styrofoam container and trying not to look at the box of her mother's letters on the seat beside her. She had enough gas to get somewhere. She did not know where somewhere was. One evening, on the restaurant's free Wi-Fi, she typed "cheap property Kansas" into a search bar the way a person presses on a sore tooth, just to confirm it still hurts. The third page of results led her to a Hartley County municipal auction notice. The county was liquidating a short list of tax-delinquent structures scheduled for demolition before May. A former grain shed, a schoolhouse annex, and near the bottom of the page, a single line that made Frances set down her coffee. Former Rutledge Rural Post Office, Township Road 14, unincorporated, Hartley County. Vacant since 2003, structure unsound, $1. A post office. She read the line 4 times. Then she looked at the box of her mother's letters on the seat beside her, tied with kitchen string, and she did not say anything out loud. But something in her chest that had been tight and cold for 14 months shifted, the way ice shifts in a river when the temperature changes by a single degree. If you have ever had a moment where something impossible lined up with something you had lost, stay with us, because what Frances found inside that building is the reason we are telling you this story tonight. Subscribe to Giant Sources and tell us in the comments where you are listening from. We read every single one. The Hartley County Courthouse was 2 hours southwest on county highways that ran arrow straight between fence rows. The clerk's office was a wood-paneled room on the ground floor. Behind the counter sat a woman named Pauline Thresh, who had been county clerk for 19 years, and who looked at Frances the way experienced clerks look at people who come in carrying everything they own in their expression. "You're here about the Rutledge Post Office," Pauline said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." Pauline set down her pen. "I will be straight with you. That building has been empty for 20 years. The roof has soft spots, the well pump is seized, No power, no heat, and the county has a demolition order on it for the 15th of May. She paused. There is no good financial reason on God's earth to buy it. Frances put a dollar bill and $40 in quarters on the counter. Pauline looked at the money. She looked at Frances. Then she reached under the counter and produced a deed form that appeared to have been sitting there waiting. The way certain things wait for the right person before they become useful. She turned it to the right page and set a pen beside it. "Sign here," she said, "and here." Frances signed her full name, Frances Viola Pruett, in the careful, upright hand her mother had taught her at the kitchen table 40 years before. The V was for Viola. She had never used her middle name officially in her life. She used it now. Pauline stamped the deed. The sound was solid and final and good. "It's yours." She slid a tarnished key across the counter. "One more thing, and then I'll let you go. My grandmother was on the Rutledge rural route when she was a girl. She used to say the postmistress out there, a woman named Edna Colby, was the most honest person in 3 counties. She paused. "I hope the building knows you're coming." Frances did not know what to say to that. So she picked up the key and walked back to the caravan, with the deed still warm from the stamp. The Rutledge Post Office was 9 miles south of the courthouse, and then 3 miles down a township road, the county's website called Improved Gravel, and Frances's front axle knew was a lie. The building sat in a clearing off the road, a low, square structure of pale Kansas limestone, quarried from this same earth for a century and stacked into everything worth keeping. The windows had been boarded with plywood gone silver gray with weather. Above the door, cast iron letters still read U.S. Post Office, though someone had taken the R and left a gap. Post Office with a missing word in the middle, like a sentence interrupted. The key turned hard, then gave. The door swung inward and Frances stepped inside. The front room was compact and orderly in the way rooms are when they have been empty long enough for even the disorder to settle. Along the back wall stood the sorting cabinet, a tall oak piece, 12 feet wide, its cubbyhole still labeled in compartment block lettering for the old rural routes. Route 1, Route 2, Route 4. The floor was wide plank pine, dusty but solid. A service counter ran the length of the room, its surface worn smooth in a long pale stripe, where customers had rested their arms and their packages and their patience for 30 years. Frances walked the length of the cabinet slowly. She ran her fingers along the cubbyholes. She picked up a rubber stamp from the counter shelf, received, it read, and held it the way her mother had held them, fingers curved, wrist loose, because the motion came to her from somewhere older than memory. Then she noticed the gap. The sorting cabinet stood a few inches from the left wall. That was not unusual. What was unusual was that the floorboards behind it, visible only from a low angle when Frances crouched to look, were a slightly different color than the rest. Darker, oiled differently. And the seam where they met the others was cut clean and deliberate, not the settling crack of an old building but the edge of something designed to open. She found an iron bar by the door hinge, worked the end of it along the seam, and the 3 darker boards lifted together on leather hinges gone stiff with age but not, after all those years, given way. Beneath them, fitted neatly between the floor joists, wrapped in oilcloth and brown paper, were 2 things. A bundled stack of envelopes, 47 of them, she would count later, still sealed, their stamps canceled in the red ink of the Rutledge office, addressed in handwriting that ranged from the careful cursive of someone well-educated to the urgent, slightly uneven print of someone who had written in bad light or bad weather or both. The postmarks ran from 1943 to 1945. Every return address was a military installation. APO San Francisco, Camp Pendleton, Naval Air Station, Corpus Christi. And beneath the envelopes a cloth-bound ledger, inside the front cover and a small, clean hand. This record is kept by Edna R. Colby, postmistress, Rutledge Rural Post Office, Hartley County, Kansas. I am writing this in the autumn of 1945, at the close of the war, because I believe that what I have found here is wrong, and I believe that wrong things, when they are written down clearly and set somewhere safe, have a better chance of being answered than when they are only remembered by one person who will not live forever. Frances sat down on the floor of the post office, with the ledger in her lap, and read it, by the thin light coming through the gap in the plywood. Edna Colby had served as postmistress at Rutledge from 1938 until 1971. In the winter of 1943, she had been assigned a postal assistant named Clifford Renner to help manage the wartime volume. She discovered, in the summer of 1945, that Clifford had been holding letters, not government notifications. Personal letters, from soldiers to their families, and from families back to their soldiers, pulled from both incoming and outgoing bundles for any household that had failed, in Clifford's judgment, to tip him adequately at Christmas or treat him with what he considered appropriate courtesy when he came to the door. 47 letters, held back across 2 years of a war. Edna had reported Clifford to the regional postal inspector. The inspector had reviewed the matter and concluded that as there were no witnesses and the letters could not be proven deliberately suppressed, the most that could be done was to quietly transfer Clifford Renner to a different district. He was transferred. He retired comfortably in 1961. Edna had kept the letters. She had tried after the inspector left to deliver them herself, but by the autumn of 1945, many of the soldiers who had written them were dead. Some families had moved. One woman she tracked down had remarried, believing her first husband had stopped writing because he no longer cared. He had in fact written her 4 letters between November 1943 and March 1944, the last of them 2 days before his ship was sunk in the Philippine Sea. Edna could not deliver the letters to the dead, but she could not destroy them either. So she had written the ledger, documenting every letter and every name, and set it beneath the floor, and closed the last page with this: "I am leaving these here because they belong to people who deserve to receive them. And even if those people are gone, the record of what they wrote and what was kept from them should not disappear. If you are reading this, you found what I left. I hope you are the kind of person who knows what to do with it. I think you must be, or you would not have looked." Frances read the ledger for 2 hours in the failing light. Before we go further, if you're still with us, please subscribe to Giant Stories and leave us a comment. Because what happens next is why Edna Colby hid everything she hid beneath that floor. She had been sleeping in the building for 3 days, on a cot beside a camp stove she had driven back to town to buy, when the first visitor came down the township road. He was an old man in a pickup the color of dried mud, and he stood in the clearing a long time before he approached. His name was Chester Bowen. He was 86 years old, and he had heard through someone at the courthouse that a woman had bought the old Rutledge Post Office and was living in it. "My grandfather wrote a letter from Okinawa," Chester said, standing in the doorway with his hat in both hands. "May of 1945. He sent it to my grandmother, and she never received it. She told my father the last letter she ever got from him was dated February, and she always felt like he had stopped thinking about her in the end, like he'd gone somewhere she couldn't reach him." Frances went to the sorting cabinet and took out the bundled letters and sat down at the counter. Her hands were not entirely steady. The 4th envelope she lifted was addressed in careful, tired handwriting to Mrs. D. Bowen, RFD 2, Rutledge, Kansas. The return address was 1st Battalion, 22nd Marines, APO 86. Chester held his grandfather's letter in both hands for a long time without opening it. When he finally did, he read it without a sound. Then he pressed it flat on the counter with his palm, the way you press something to make sure it is real, and said quietly, to no one in particular, he was thinking about her. He was thinking about her the whole time. Frances made him coffee on the camp stove and let him sit as long as he needed to. After Chester, others came, the way people do when word moves through a small county. Pauline Thresh drove out with a box of records and the name of a state archivist in Topeka who needed to hear about those 47 letters immediately. A woman named Clara Meade drove 2 hours with a casserole. Her great-uncle's name was in Edna's ledger, a letter he'd sent from a naval base in 1944 that never arrived. She didn't want the letter back, she said. She just wanted to know it had been real. Then, 11 days after Frances had set $40 in quarters, on Pauline's counter, a black SUV came down the township road and stopped in the clearing, and a man in a sport coat climbed out and looked at the limestone building, the way men look at things they have already decided belong to them. His name was Gerald Renner. He was 63, and he was Clifford Renner's grandson. And he explained with the measured warmth of a man who had found that warmth opens doors that bluntness does not, that he had only recently learned through family records that his grandfather had once worked at this location. He felt, he said, a certain sentimental connection. He had also noticed some irregularities in the county's tax foreclosure process that suggested the sale to Frances might not be entirely clean. He had spoken with an attorney. He smiled when he said attorney. Frances, who had spent 34 years helping people find what they needed to know, watched the smile and understood it completely. She did not tell him about the letters. She did not mention Edna Colby's ledger or what it contained, or the 60 years of carefully documented wrong that sat behind her in that cloth-bound book. She told him her title was good, that she had purchased the building lawfully, and that she did not intend to sell it for any amount. Then she stood in the doorway until his SUV went back up the township road. She stood in the clearing long after the dust settled, with the spring wind coming off the plane and the brass door key cold in her palm, and she thought. Edna did not put that ledger under the floor because she expected the past to fix itself. She put it there to give the next person something to fight with. Pauline Thresh, when Frances brought Gerald Renner's attorney's letter to the courthouse, read it once, set down her reading glasses, and said a word Frances had not expected from a county official. Then she went to her filing cabinets. What the record showed was this: Clifford Renner had held no ownership interest in the Rutledge Post Office. The building had been federal property until 2003, when it was decommissioned and transferred to Hartley County for $1. The county had taken clear title. The county had sold that clear title to Frances Pruett for $1. Gerald Renner's claim rested on the theory that the county's tax foreclosure had been procedurally improper, a theory that collapsed when Pauline produced a certified mail receipt from 2018 showing that notice of the pending cessus had been sent to and signed for by a member of Gerald Renner's own household. He'd had 3 years to pay $2,200 in back taxes and redeem the property. He had not done so because in 2018 a limestone block building at the end of a bad county road had been worth to a man like Gerald Renner exactly nothing. A wireless company had since changed the math, but the law had not. Frances's attorney, a young woman at the county legal aid office who took the case for filing fees once she read Edna's ledger, answered Gerald Renner's letter with a response that contained one quiet sentence near the end. It noted that should the matter proceed, the defendant intended to introduce into evidence a contemporaneous written record of the conduct of Gerald Renner's grandfather at these premises, including the documented names of every military family from whom letters had been deliberately withheld during wartime. Gerald Renner withdrew his claim before the month was out. The wireless company put its tower on a hilltop 11 miles east, on land owned by a rancher who was glad of the lease money and who waved at Frances every time he passed her road. But before Frances finalized any of the paperwork, she found the entry in Edna's ledger that stopped her cold. She read it 4 times. Route 2, November 1943. Mrs. V. Pruett, RFD 2, Rutledge. Letter from son PFC Leonard Pruett, Camp Pendleton. Found in Renner's held stack. Delivered personally by EC on the 14th of November. Mrs. Pruett very grateful. Gave me a jar of apple butter and shook my hand and said she didn't know what she would have done. V. Pruett. Viola Pruett, her grandmother, on her father's side, on the Rutledge rural route in 1943. Her uncle Leonard had come home from the Pacific in 1946. He had married and had children and had grandchildren and had lived to be 91 years old. Frances had known him her whole life. She had sat beside him at holiday tables and borrowed his pocket knife at county fairs and attended his funeral 7 years ago on a gray October morning. And she had never known, could not have known, that there had been a woman at a postal counter in 1943 who had pulled a letter out of a held stack and driven it out a dirt road herself, rather than let a mother not know her son was alive. Frances sat with the ledger in Edna's chair for a long time, while the late light came level through the reglazed windows. She thought about her mother Viola, standing at a counter for 31 years, saying, "Have a good day now." She thought about 34 years of library books carried in her own car, to people who could not come to her. She thought about Ray's debts, and the house, and the checking account, and the Denny's parking lot in March. And she thought about the particular way that life sometimes cuts a person loose from the life they built, and sends them, broke and bewildered, down a gravel road to the one place that has been quietly holding their family's story all along. It is a strange thing to discover you did not arrive somewhere by accident. That the place had been waiting. That the woman who built it had known, without knowing your name. That someone like you would eventually find the key useful. Chester Bowen came back the following Saturday with 4 other people, descendants of soldiers named in Edna's ledger, and they sat around a folding table. Frances had found at the Hartley County thrift store and read pieces of the ledger aloud. And they looked at photographs someone brought, and at some point in the middle of that afternoon it stopped being a gathering about old letters and became something else. It became what a post office had always been meant to be, a room where separate people arrived, carrying separate things and left slightly less alone. The 47 letters went to the Kansas State Historical Society, where an archivist spent 6 months tracing the descendants of every sender and recipient. 31 families received copies. Howard Bowen's letter was framed and hung in Chester Bowen's living room, beside a photograph of the grandmother who had spent 40 years believing her husband had forgotten her in the end. Frances started a program she called Hartley Reads, not a library and not a post office, but owing something to both. A place where the county's most isolated residents could request books by phone and receive them by volunteer delivery, and where once a month a rotating group gathered in the old sorting room to read aloud to whoever came. She ran it out of the Rutledge Post Office because it was her building, and because Edna Colby had spent 30 years deciding that every address on her route was worth the drive, and Frances did not see any reason to argue with that. By the second winter she had 22 households on the delivery list. By the third, 38, spread across 4 townships, served by 9 volunteers who drove their own vehicles in bad weather, on worse roads because, as one of them said when Frances thanked her, the books were waiting and the roads were there and somebody had to go. She kept Edna's ledger on the shelf behind the service counter, where she could see it from her chair. She kept her mother's letters in their kitchen string bundle in the drawer below. She kept a jar of apple butter on the windowsill. Not her grandmother's, that one was long gone, but one a neighbor had pressed on her in October, because it seemed right to keep in a building that had once accepted a jar of apple butter as sufficient payment for making sure a mother knew her son was alive. On a clear evening in early November, 2 years after she had set Fort 40s and quarters on a county clerk's counter and signed her mother's name in full, for the first time in her life, Frances Pruett sat in Edna Colby's chair at the Rutledge Post Office service counter. The sorting cabinet cubbyholes were full of paperbacks now. The roof held. The well ran cold and clean. Through the window she had reglazed herself, badly first and then better. She watched the last light going out of the Kansas sky. A long, slow amber line between the earth and the coming dark. She thought about Edna Colby, who had sat in this room for 30 years, and decided, every single day, that the mail would arrive, that the letter would be delivered, that no address was too far and no name too small, and the people on her routes deserved to receive what had been sent to them, and who had done that year after year, without a witness, without a record anyone was keeping, because she believed, had to believe, that the small honest things a person does in the dark will be real long after the person is gone. She thought about Chester Bowen pressing his grandfather's letter flat on the counter with his palm. She thought about her grandmother Viola, standing on a dirt road in November 1943, shaking the hand of a woman she had never met, not knowing what she would have done. That is what an exchange is, finally. Not the building and not the equipment. It is the decision, made quietly and without applause, that the person on the other end of the line is worth reaching. It is the willingness to go the extra 3 miles down a bad road in the cold because someone addressed that letter to someone, and it is your job, it has always been your job, to make sure it arrives. Frances Pruett was 58 years old and widowed, and down to her last $340 when she spent $1 on an abandoned post office at the end of a Kansas County road. It was the best dollar she ever spent. Every morning before the light, she still unlocks the door, still makes the coffee, still opens the window to the plane, and when the phone rings, and it rings, every morning, because there are people out there who need to hear a voice before they can begin the day, she picks it up the way her mother picked up a rubber stamp, the way Edna Colby picked up a letter that was never supposed to reach its address. The mail does not decide who is worth reaching. She never forgot that.